Welcome, my friends, to the Sage Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my very special guest is Mark Devlin. Mark is a UK-based club and radio DJ and music journalist, and has played live in over 40 countries around the world. In more recent years, he has begun investigating and speaking about the dark forces that have been manipulating and controlling the mainstream music industry for decades. Mark's research has led to the publication of his book, Musical Truth. In this conversation, Mark will explain how the corporate music industry is engaged in mass mind control and has been for a very long time. And no discussion with Mark would be complete without talking about the death of Paul McCartney back in 1966 and being replaced by one William Shepard. And so without further ado, here's the show with Mark Devlin. Welcome to the show, Mark. It's a pleasure having you join me. You were so kind back in November, I think it was, of last year to have me on to talk about the Paul is Dead conspiracy based upon the book The Memoirs of Billy Shears by Tommy Harriet. And we will certainly talk about Paul is Dead during this show. Our listeners would be disappointed, I guess, if you didn't and I didn't, but we will get there. But I really wanted to spend some time talking to you about your current book, Musical Truth, which is a great book. It's 500 pages, and you go into great detail with regard to how the music industry utilizes music in order to condition the population. Essentially, it's mind control, especially when we talk about pop music, and it's there as a weapon by the controllers in order to steer consciousness, in order to establish certain beliefs and values and societal norms and those types of things there. So I really want to get into this because I think it's very, very important, and many people have no idea what's going on under the covers when they're listening to songs on the radio or playing a CD or playing MP3s on their phone and so on. It's really a very nefarious agenda. And with this show, we're going to spend some time digging in to find out what's really going on. But before we do that, Mark, I was wondering if we could just take a moment here and if you can just take us through your journey in life and how it is that you wound up doing the work that you're doing today, essentially researching and investigating the music business. So if you can do that for us, it would be great.
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks for getting me on the show. It's great to connect with you. As you said, you guested on my show a few weeks ago and we had a great chat. And I'm not really doing any radio interviews this year because I'm actually writing the follow-up to Musical Truth at the moment, Musical Truth Volume 2, because this whole subject area is so vast that even in the massive book that Musical Truth Volume 1 was, at 170,000 words across 536 pages, it still only just scratches the surface of everything there is to know about what the music industry is being used for. So there's way more to tell, and I'm doing that in the second book. And so because writing a book is such a vast undertaking in terms of the time and the resources that it uses up, I've decided not to do radio interviews this year, and I'm not really doing talks and conference appearances, with the exception of Free Your Mind in the US in April and a conference in Ireland in February. So the rest of this year is going to be spent solidly head down writing. But I did want to make an exception for your show because I love your work and I felt it was only right to come and guest on yours as you'd been a great guest on mine. So, that's the preface to how I come to be here today. But this will probably be the only radio interview I do this year, certainly the only one I plan to do. So to answer your question about how I got on this path, my background is I'm a club and radio DJ of some 20 plus years. And for many years, that was my life. It was my identity. And if you'd asked me who I was, I'd have said, well, I'm a DJ. That just defines what I'm all about. And I went along that path for such a long time, completely oblivious to the idea that there could be anything nefarious or anything going on beneath the glossy surface of the industries that I was involved with. And this went on all the way really to 2010, which is the year where I had my conscious awakening, as I refer to it as. There were a few kind of seeds that were sown prior to that, around about 2007, 2008, when I first came across the books of David Icke. And I started reading those, and I came to realize that there's lots more to know about the world than what we're told by the mainstream news and by governments. So I already had some understanding of the fact that there were certain individuals and certain networks and groups that were controlling every aspect of human life behind the scenes. But I hadn't made the connection at that point as to how it played out into the industry that I was a part of, the music industry. So it took until 2010 before all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle kind of slotted together in my mind. and something just clicked, and I was able to see everything so much clearer than I had before. And I really don't know what it was that made it happen at that time. And I can only really reflect that everything in creation, everything in this reality happens when its time comes and not a minute before. So there's a reason for why the timings play out the way that that they do. And I can look back on the 20 years that I spent as a DJ working very closely with the music that I now talk about in the book, and even associating with some of the artists who I'm now exposing in the book. And I wonder how it is that I missed what is now so plain for me to see. And it's very easy to look at those years and consider them wasted years. And you can think, all that time that I could have been spending doing something more constructive. But as I mentioned, everything happens for a reason. And I've come to understand that when we incarnate into this reality, we're giving our spirit souls the lessons that they need to grow and evolve on their journey. And that journey will be different for each individual, which is why we go through such different experiences in life. But the experiences that we do go through are exactly the ones that we need to take us to where, in a higher state of consciousness, we've decided we need to go. So that's something I've reflected on in recent years, and it helps me make sense of why it was that it took so long for me to get on the path that I'm on now. But I am on it, and what I'm doing now is very different to what I'd done before. So I came to an understanding of how these groups and these networks of dark occultists, because that's basically what we're talking about, run the entertainment industries in the same way as they run politics and finance and the worlds of academia and science and the mainstream media and big business and the military and every other walk of life you can think of. And that became my specialist area. I wanted to know exactly how it was that they got such a stranglehold on the music industry and how it was being used for mind control and social engineering purposes. And the more I delved into the subject, which is a process I'm sure you're familiar with, the deeper and deeper it got and the more different directions it branched off into. And whereas, first of all, I thought the story was all about some dark occult symbolism that was going into pop videos of the past few years, so, pyramids and all seeing eyes in Katy Perry videos and Lady Gaga videos, I pretty much thought that was the extent of it. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized it goes back further and further and further. And before you know it, you're looking at stuff from the 1980s, the 1970s, you're going way back to the 60s, to the 50s, to the very establishment of the corporate music industry. Then it goes back even further than that into previous forms of music and into Hollywood. And you realize that this agenda has been going on forever. And there are so many different ways in which it expresses itself. And so, as I say, the research just led me into all these different kind of areas. And I put everything that I'd come to learn over the course of 5 years worth of research into the book, Musical Truth 1. And so it took 13 months to write, and it's based on, 5 years worth of coming to terms with what was really going on. And that's why the subject matter discussed in the book is so diverse. So we go from the very early days of the industry, we go from looking at the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the evidence that there is to suggest that both these groups were products of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is this organisation all about culture creation and social engineering. Then we get into the whole Paul is dead, McCartney replacement thing, which it seems I can't do an interview at all without getting into, and that's fine because it's a subject that does need to get out there. And then we get into the Laurel Canyon scene, the hippie counterculture scene coming out of LA in the 1960s, which was the work of Dave McGowan in his brilliant book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and all the implications that his findings have for the true nature of many of these musicians and these cultural icons that we all look up to. Because when you get into the family backgrounds of these people, you find time and time again connections going back into the world of military intelligence, whether it's the CIA or the FBI or the Pentagon or MI5, MI6, connections into Tavistock, time and time again with so many prominent musicians. And it goes way beyond the realms of random chance that this could just be one of those things. So there's that aspect to it. Also in the book, I'm discussing trauma-based mind control, MK Ultra, this wide-reaching program that came out of the CIA and all the different spin-offs of it, specifically Monarch programming, which is very much at work with many people's favorite musicians, particularly in the contemporary era in these times, is absolutely endemic in Hollywood as well. So there's a big section on how mind control works and all the symbolism that goes with it in pop videos and in movies and in promotional press shots and things like that, which give you a little indication of the presence of mind control. Then we get into the transhumanist agenda and the direction that the social engineers want to take human society in a very short period of time, and how there's all kinds of hints and clues and indicators of what they want to do going into music videos as well. And we get into the systematic degeneration of hip-hop culture and black culture generally. There's a big chapter on that, and a whole load of other stuff as well, which I've probably forgotten. But it's very, very far-reaching, and there's so many different strands to it. And, you know, I got to the end of that book and then realized that there had to be another one to tell the rest of the story. And that's what I'm doing now. So in a very roundabout way, that's how I got to the point that I'm currently at. And if you told me a few years ago that I'd be doing this, I would have laughed in your face and told you you're crazy. But, you know, synchronicity and life is an interesting thing in terms of where it takes you if you're open to it and if you're prepared to go to, you know, where your consciousness and your free will takes you.
You know, it's interesting, Mark. You mentioned MK Ultra, social engineering. One of the things I realized is that these are not separate undertakings or separate initiatives by the controllers. You mentioned Tavistock is a main cog in that controlling apparatus. That all of these agendas and these initiatives, they are interconnected. And I think that's what a lot of people have a hard time getting their heads wrapped around. They look at these things as silos. They really don't realize that it's interconnected, that it all plays into one big agenda at the end of the day. What are your thoughts on that?
It does, and it goes way beyond the realms of coincidence and random chance that all these things could be happening independent of each other. You know, so if you were looking at an agenda that was just coming out of the UK and was just affecting UK artists, you might be able to write it off if you felt so compelled as just the way things have panned out. But when you realize the same agenda is playing out in the United States and you see exactly the same kind of symbolism and exactly the same kind of lyrical themes being explored in records and exactly the same kind of production styles going into music and exactly the same kind of sound frequencies being used at exactly the same time, you come to realize that it does go beyond the realms of straight coincidence. And then you see the same agenda being played out all across Europe and in places like Korea and Japan and South Africa and Australia. And, you know, you've got to be in a very heavy state of denial to not then see that this whole thing is interconnected. It becomes very difficult to pinpoint exactly who is doing the controlling and the manipulating, of course, because a question I often get from people is, you know, who are these individuals? Give us some names. Who's doing all this? And, you know, they do work in secret. They do work through secret societies. And they don't like the glare of the public spotlight. So, of course, they do their stuff from behind the scenes. There are certain individuals that they use as their foot soldiers. So we can look at names like Dr. Luke, who is a very prominent producer of pop music. And he was involved in a scandal with the artist Kesha quite recently, where she launched a legal case against him, claiming that he was her mind control handler and that he'd raped her and sexually abused her over a prolonged period of time. So we get names like Dr. Luke thrown out there, real name Lucas Gottwald. There was this guy called Sam Lutfi who was involved in a legal case with Britney Spears a few years ago, and that was quite similar. That was all about control of her business affairs and control of her personal movements and stuff like that. And there was a big argument going on between the Spears family and this guy Sam Lutfi. So, you know, we get names like that. And then, of course, there are prominent artists like Jay-Z. You hear his name banded around the whole time as quite a prominent player in what's being done in the hip-hop scene. He seems to wield quite some influence. There's rumors that he might be a Freemason or that he's a member of this Boole secret society, which is reserved specifically for black people. So you get the odd name like that thrown around. But the real controllers are, of course, staying out of the spotlight. And people say, well, who is it? Is it the Jesuits? Is it the Vatican? Is it the Rosicrucians? Is it the Freemasons? Is it the Rothschilds? And, if you're honest about it, we don't really know the individual identities of the people that are doing the controlling. But you can know that it's going on just by viewing what's happening and looking at the symbolism, looking at the clues. We are given clues the whole time. They drop little symbolic depictions and representations of what it is they're doing into music videos, into live stage shows, into photographs, into record sleeves. They've been doing that forever. You can trace it right back to the days of the Beatles and all the clues they were putting into their album sleeves back in the 60s and even before that. So they let us know that they're there, and you can feel the presence of the hidden hand the whole time. But it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly who it is that's doing it. So I think it's very important that researchers such as yourself, myself, and many others do get on the path to exposing all this stuff and getting it out there as widely as possible so that people have a chance to understand what's being done to them. And then they can make the free will decision to not be taken in by the mind control and the shaping of values and morals, which is being done to us subliminally, because that ultimately is what this is all about. It's debasing people's morals. It's changing people's value systems. It's changing people's perceptions of themselves, of the world, of what goes on. And all this is being done through what masquerades as entertainment. And that's what makes it so ingenious, because nobody's expecting to be mind controlled when they're listening to some music from their favorite band. They're unwinding from the stresses and the hardships of their working week to some music that they enjoy, or they're watching a favorite TV program, or they're going to the movie theater to watch a latest film. And nobody expects to be programmed and conditioned in that way when they're just enjoying some entertainment. But that is when your guard is down, of course. People are suspicious of the mainstream news, or lots of people are, and so they should be. And people are suspicious of what government ministers say, and they should be. But people tend not to be so suspicious when they're listening to music or watching a movie. And the brilliant thing about it is that's where all the mind control is done. And not only that, but people pay for it. People actually pay for their own mind control. They'll quite happily pay to go and see a movie. They'll happily pay to buy a CD. And they don't realize that that's what's being done. But yeah, getting back to your question, it is all coordinated, all these different strands. They do all fit together. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. And when you can see how it all works together, if you've got a mind open enough to take that on board, then it's very revelatory indeed. And, it's researchers such as us, I feel, that are putting those pieces together. It's very vital for us to continue doing so.
I get the same question, Mark. People will ask me, who's at the top of the pyramid? Who are the true puppet masters? And really what people are looking for are simple answers to very complex questions. And
like it's Jacob Rothschild. He's the one.
Yeah, they just want a name. And I guess, I don't know, maybe they'll feel better if they have a name and they can just walk away and go about their business. But what I try to explain to folks is I call them the shadow people. And rest assured that we have fraternal orders and secret societies that run the world, where they control virtually everything. And we're not supposed to know, and in all likelihood, we will never know who the true puppet masters are. It's designed to keep us from getting to the truth. So, and then you mentioned before about the person coming home from work and, working 50, 60 hours a week and just wanting to relax. The brilliance of their evil is what they do is they take advantage of people when they're really most vulnerable in many cases.
That's right.
Like you said, they don't know that they're being programmed or that their mind is being stolen from them if you're putting on a CD or you're going to a concert or you're watching a television show. But that's exactly what's going on. And people really need to, hopefully by listening to this show, reading your book, they will begin to understand that they really need to scrutinize this a lot.
And people are in such heavy denial when it comes to this, because when you suggest to somebody that this is what's happening, you're implying that they've been taken in, that they've been duped, that they've been mugged off. And of course they have. And I was, I'm openly coming out and saying, yes, for many, many years, I was being deceived and I was made a mug of. And I don't like the fact that I was, but I can recognize it, and now I can resolve to not get fooled in the same way again. But people hate it when you bring this information to them. And they will hate the messenger more than they will hate those that are actually creating the problem. So you can tell them that, you know, if they're a lifelong Rolling Stones fan, you can point out many of the dark, occult, unsettling, sinister elements to the Rolling Stones history and point out their connection to groups like the Church of Satan and the Process Church and all this kind of stuff. And they'll hate you for it because they love the Rolling Stones and they don't want to hear it. Well, it's not me that made this happen. It's not me that made it this way, and I would never have chosen for it to be this way. I'm just someone that's recognized what's going on, and I've taken on the moral responsibility to communicate this information to other people, because when you come to truth, you can't just sit on your ass and do nothing with it. It's not enough just to absorb it and say, okay, now I understand what's going on in the world, and I'm just going to hold on to that information and, make it work for me. You take on that responsibility when you come to these understandings of spreading that as far and wide as you can so that other people have the opportunity to come to these understandings in the same way that you did. So that's why I do this. You know, I don't do this for fun. Absolutely not. So many other things I prefer to be doing. But I recognize that I'm in a position to be able to put this information out. And as someone that can write and as someone that's done radio and can communicate in that way, that's what I need to do to play my part and participate in the process that needs to take place. But people hate to hear it, and they're in very heavy denial because they don't want to admit that they've been mugged off. Well, we've all been mugged off. Every one of us. We've spent our entire lives being lied to and being conditioned through the so-called education system, through all the lies that we've got from government, all the lies we've been told by the mainstream media. You know, it's not that we're stupid, or it's not that there's anything we need to feel ashamed of, because we've all been deceived in the same way. So the question becomes, which of us want to continue being lied to and being mugs and living in that deception, and which of us are mature enough to admit that we've been taken in and now want to find out how it was done and make sure it doesn't happen again.
No one should feel bad because it is an agenda of deception. I remember telling one guest going back about a year ago, it was Ole Damagard when Ole was on the show, and I said that anything worth knowing is a lie. You know, in the research that I have done, and I've done a lot of research over many years, I found that to be true. And, you know, we talked a little earlier, you did, about digging in and getting further down that rabbit hole. One of the other things that astonished me when I first got started with this, it really doesn't rattle my cage today because I've just gotten acclimated to this is the way it is. The deeper you go into that rabbit hole, first of all, it almost seems like it's never ending.
Yeah.
The more bizarre the stuff gets. You know, it's very, very interesting. You start at a certain level and you dig a little ways down and then you find some more information and you just keep going and going.
Yeah,
and
the
going.
more you know you don't know.
Exactly. Now, in your book, you touched on this just a little while ago. Here's a quote from you forward. There are many things I prefer to be doing with my life than putting out information like this, but truth is truth, and it remains so eternally regardless of whether any one individual likes it, believes it, or chooses to look at it. Now, my question to you is, do you view your research as a drive to awaken people in an evangelizing fashion, or is it more about putting the truth out there and then it becomes the responsibility of each individual to pursue the truth?
Well, it has to be the latter, because I can't force this stuff down anyone's throat, and I shouldn't either, because the world is already full of people telling you what you must believe. You know, fundamental religious leaders with their rhetoric insisting that their religion is the true one and everyone else has got it wrong and you've got to listen to them. And politicians saying the same thing. You know, the last thing the world needs is somebody else saying you have to believe this. You have to take this information on board. My job finishes when I've put the information out there and given people an opportunity to look at it and make up their own minds what to do with it. You know, that's my karma relieved, if you like. That's my participation made. So I do wish it wasn't this way, but it is. And so I have to knuckle down and get this work done. And in all honesty, Mike, I don't expect to see any major changes of the magnitude that needs to take place in my lifetime. What I feel I'm doing is sowing seeds for future generations. And I think that if enough of us keep on doing our thing and making our own individual contributions to the process, then it is going to have ramifications into the future. And who knows how many years from now, 30, 50, 100, 200, maybe more years from now, maybe the fruits of our labor will, start to be felt. So I'm under no illusion to the fact that it's going to feel like I'm beating my head against a wall probably for the rest of my days, because I'm not going to see immediate results to the information that I and so many others are putting out there. But I feel that it will have its impact when it needs to, and at some point in the future, that this work will pay off. And I just can't stand the thought that the generation we have now will squander the chance to expose the agenda that we have, and will not step up to that responsibility, because we have a major responsibility, people of our generation, because we remember better times. So much has changed in society over the course of the last 20 years. I make this point in the book as well, that if you take it back to 1996, very few people had mobile phones. Very few people were using laptops. The internet was in its infancy. Nobody was using Facebook and social media and stuff like that. You could still walk into a grocery store and pay with cash to an actual human being behind a counter. You didn't have barcodes all over the place. You could actually phone your electricity or water company and speak to an actual human being without having to go through a bloody robot system. And vocalists on records, that was actually their voice that you were hearing and not one that had been plugged through a computer. So all these changes have happened in such a short period of time. And it's people of my generation that can remember what life was like before that, going back into the early 90s and back into the 80s and things like that. And then you can look at agendas like chemtrails, geoengineering. And most researchers agree that that agenda has been in place for pretty much the last 20 years. So, most of them take it back to the mid-90s. And if you look at what was happening before that, that agenda was not really full throttle going back into the 1980s. And then you can look at the changing face of technology in terms of the way people consume music and even movies now. Everything is digital. Everything is electronic. There are young people today that have never seen a vinyl record. They've got no idea what a cassette was. They've got no idea what a video recorder was. Their idea of how you get music is downloading an MP3, usually to their phone, listening to it on some shitty, tinny little headphones, where everything just sounds terrible and you don't get the full frequency range of the recording. And that's their idea of how music sounds and how music is delivered. And then, they'll go to a nightclub and see a DJ playing off a laptop and they're just chucking a load of MP3s on, some of which they probably burnt off of YouTube. And that's their idea of what a DJ is and what a DJ does. They have no concept of how things used to be, where you had to actually hunt out records and go after these vinyl tunes and spend time, putting your set list together. So it's people of my age and my generation that remember how things used to be and can see how different they are now and how the social engineering agenda is in full effect. And if we just sit on our asses and do nothing, then this generation is going to die out, and all our knowledge and all our memories and all our perspectives are going to die out with us. And the next generation along will not have those perspectives and will not be able to make the connections between what was and what is going on now. And that is a very dangerous thing to happen, I think. And that would happen if enough of us didn't step up and do what we need to do at these times right now. Sometimes it involves making a bit of a personal sacrifice. You have to speak out. You might lose some friends. A few people will think you're crazy. You might find it more difficult to get certain jobs or recruitments or whatever, but it just needs to be done. And now the times that we're living in are very crucial times, and they're going to determine how things pan out for generations in the future.
Well, I agree with you, Mark. It was good to hear you give your perspective on this is not going to be something that's going to turn around in our lifetime. I have said the exact same thing to folks who ask me, Mike, is this going to change in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years? I said, look, this is a slow go. It's very methodical, because all you need to do is take a look around you. You can see how many people still don't get it. So I look at the work that we're doing as table setting. Now, what that means is it's incumbent upon the young folks to grab that baton and to embrace the truth. And that's why we see the program or the agenda by the controllers targeting the young people, folks like yourself and myself and many others that are in the alternative research and truth community to get the young people to get their heads wrapped around the fact that, hey, you need to pay attention to this. There are lies and deception all around you. And then you've got the dark side continuing to push their garbage and their junk into the minds of these people to ensure that, they stay on that track of being unaware and just going about their business being controlled unknowingly. That's the thing that's the most brilliant part of their evil is people don't even see their own captivity. They don't see their own oppression. That's really, to me, the most mind-boggling thing. And, and I'm not getting on my high horse here because like yourself, my awakening took place, I guess around 2006 or so. Before that, I was on the hamster wheel like everybody else. And it was a slow go. Finally what happened was I started to become aware of certain things and I would start looking into it. And at first I would be, no, you got to be kidding me. That can't be true, or that can't be real, or that can't be right. And then only to dig more and more and then start to piece it together. And I landed in the same place that you landed. So, and you're absolutely right about our generation remembering the way things used to be. Today, everything is automated and mechanized. The human element has been completely stripped out of the equation. And this is by design.
Absolutely.
By design.
Yeah.
You also mentioned the young folks listening to their songs on their little earbuds, on their phones. And I remember you and I listening to, like you said, on vinyl records, the analog signal, having the speakers, we can hear the full range, the dynamic range of the music. It was an experience to be able to do that. I remember back when I was a kid, we used to go to great lengths with equalizers and our speakers and so on to get the best sound we possibly can from that record for a listening experience. Today, is it a listening experience? I don't know what it is today when you have two earbuds in your ears walking around with a phone or, an iPod in your hand.
Yeah. Well, it's not for me, that way of listening to music. I can't stand to have those things in. But you make a very good point about how they've always got young people in their sights. It's always the young people they're after to mind control because they're the most malleable, because they're less experienced in life. They tend to be less cynical, less world weary, less suspicious than someone of my age. I'm 46 years of age, so I've been around a bit. And like I said, I think my generation is the key link between how things used to be and where they want to take things. And they're just waiting for my generation to die off so that all our perspectives and all our experience and all our knowledge dies off with us. And, if we're not leaving something behind for the next generation to look at in terms of information so that they can understand how this whole thing has been done, then that's a very dangerous thing indeed. And those of us that have kids, we've really got to be thinking about the sort of world that they're going to have to grow up in if things are allowed to continue the way they are. And going back to my point about future generations, if we have kids, then, our grandkids and our great grandkids and these generations going off into the future, our descendants are going to be living in an absolute nightmare world, which we've allowed to take place if we don't, do whatever we can to stop it in its tracks. They're always after young people. And I often cite this meeting which took place in 1969 of the Planned Parenthood group, which was part of the Rockefeller Foundation. And it's all about eugenics, basically. Planned Parenthood is an organization which Bill Gates's father was a key member of. And Bill Gates himself is, definitely a eugenicist. That's where his values lie. And I often cite this meeting. It's one that David Icke always brings up in his talks and his books, but I put it out there because it's such a brilliant way of demonstrating how the controllers plan their moves so long in advance, decades in advance. They know where they're going. They know what the projected agenda is 50, maybe even 100 years into the future. So there was this meeting which took place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and there was a guy called Dr. Richard Day who was wheeled out to this group of delegates at this Planned Parenthood meeting. And he was outlining all the social changes that were due to take place in society in the coming decades. And it was a group of pediatricians. So you might think, well, why would a senior pediatrician have access to information about how culture was going to change? Well, it's because he came out of one of these groups, which is part of the secret society network, and they all communicate with each other, and they all plan together, and they know what the projected agenda is because they share that information, but they keep it closely guarded to their own kind, their own circle, and the rest of us aren't supposed to know about it. But every now and again, we get the opportunity to know. So the story goes that this guy, Richard Day, addressed all the guests, and he said, this information is for your ears only. It's for your information, and please don't take notes or make recordings. But apparently there was one guy by the name of Lawrence Dunnigan who did decide to take notes, and so he surreptitiously jotted down what was being said in the meeting. And shortly before he died, many, many years later, he came out and revealed the contents of that meeting, and he talked about all the stuff that they were told in March 1969 about what was going to happen in the coming decades. And he was spot on in absolutely every aspect. He was talking about how they were going to degrade morals through movies and through music. They were going to desensitize people to sex and violence through what they would see in movies and TV shows, so that in the end, anything would be fair game. You could see any kind of depraved act or any kind of violent act in a movie, and through a slow period of conditioning over several years, people would just come to accept it. It would be a slow drip thing. You know, you wouldn't go straight away and put these scenes into movies, but you would gradually get people used to seeing more and more daring, more and more risque things, so that they would end up being unshockable. And a good example of how that is done, I feel, in the music industry was through Eminem. Because I can remember when Eminem first launched with his Slim Shady album in 1999, the stuff that he was talking about was absolutely shocking to people. He was talking about murdering his baby mother, you know, slitting her throat, taking her out to dump her body in the lake in the middle of the night, and taking his young daughter with him and getting his daughter to help him push the body into the lake. And he's talking about, you know, rape and drug abuse and all kinds of stuff. And people were absolutely shocked by this. They'd never heard anything like it. But by a couple of years later, Eminem had put out loads of tracks where he's talking about all these outrageous things. And there's a line in one of his tracks where he goes, wait, he didn't just say what I think he did he? But by a couple of years' time, people are used to it, and they just say, oh, yes, Eminem, what is he like? He's crazy, isn't he? And they've just got used to him talking about rape and murder and mutilation, so it becomes normal. It just becomes a joke thing, you know. That's the way they slowly desensitize people. But going back to this 1969 meeting, what they said was, it's the young people, the younger generation, that we need to target with all these mind control and social engineering programs. And he actually made a comment to the effect that, don't worry about the older generation. It doesn't matter that they won't like what we're doing, because they're irrelevant. In a short period of time, they'll have died out, they'll be gone, and they don't matter. So just concentrate on the young people. And that's what we see all the time. With all this toxic garbage music that's coming out now, the debasement and degeneration of so-called hip-hop, all the shite stuff that's going into pop music, all the auto-tune, all the garbage stuff that you're seeing in videos, is all aimed at young people with malleable, impressionable minds that don't have any memory of how things used to be better, so they've got nothing to compare it to. Like I said, you know, kids today don't even know what a vinyl record is. An MP3 is all they've known. So it's always the young people. They're so easy to mind control. So because they're the ones that are in the crosshairs of the social engineers, they are the ones that also have to be in the target of those of us that are trying to get this information out there. And I do notice that at most of the talks and seminars and conferences that I attend, the delegates in the audience are pretty much in their 40s, 50s, 60s upwards. You don't see many people in their 20s and 30s at these kind of events. And I don't hear many people in their 20s and 30s phoning into radio shows of this kind of nature. You know, it tends to be people of 40 plus who have figured it out, who've got it, who are absorbing this kind of information. And in many ways, you're kind of preaching to the converted when all you do is speak to people of that age. We've got to find ways of getting through to people in their teens, 20s, early 30s, and pointing out how this agenda is being aimed at them. They're the ones that are being controlled by this stuff. And that's a very difficult thing. I'm not claiming I've got the answer as to how that can be done. I'm just saying that I think it's very important to find ways of doing that whenever we can.
Yeah, the young people are definitely the target. and they go after them every which way from Sunday. So
Yeah.
they're saturated with this agenda. And you had mentioned, Mark, about their planning being decades and decades in advance of when things eventually roll out. And you're absolutely right. The controllers are extremely proactive. They know how all of this works. They are masters of manipulation and mind control. They're not reactive. In very rare instances, I would say, are they reacting. And they don't really have to react because for a very, very, very long time, the masses were unaware of the program. So, they can continue to just march along and roll their agenda out. And I would say that if folks go back, and I mention this to people sometimes, go back and read the Protocols of Zion, which I think dates back to 1903. Now, Some folks will say that that's a hoax and so on. I don't think it is, because if you go back and take a look and you actually read the Protocols of Zion, again, over 100 years ago, and you take a look at the agenda, what was being spelled out, it's stunning when you look at it today and you look back over 100 years ago to see what was on the table and where they were going. And most of what was written in the Protocols of Zion has manifested. It's here today. We are living it.
People would like it to be a fake. It'd be more convenient to write it off as a hoax. It's the same thing as the memoirs of Billy Shears, isn't it? There's a lot of Beatles fans would like to say that book is a hoax, but you read it and you look at the validity of the information and how it's spot on in so many instances. And if you're really honest with yourself, you have to say, well, this could only have come from somebody with a lot of inside knowledge of what's really going on. And that's probably the case with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as well. Much as we'd like to say it was a fake, it seems to have been bang on the money.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's a fake at all. And that's what happens when something gets revealed and it gets too close to home. It's too hot in the kitchen. They will say it's a fake, it's a hoax.
Yeah, because people can relax again then into complacency. If they just say, oh, it's a fake, it's a hoax, we don't need to pay attention to that, then they can just carry on as they were, and it's not something they need to take responsibility for, is it?
Right. And the point you made about trying to connect with the young people, it's very, very difficult. I've been trying to think through it myself. Now, I have personal experience because within my circle of friends and family, there were teenagers, young adults who are 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, and so on. And, Mark, when I have conversations with them, and I don't try to hit them hot and heavy with this stuff because they'll just back off. I try to segue very incrementally and methodically into some of these conversations. And many times they will look at me like I'm a lunatic because they are so detached, so unaware of what it is that you and I are trying to get across and what we're trying to communicate, you and I and many others, that it becomes, sometimes I have to take a step back and think to myself, can this ever get done? This appears so daunting, so daunting. But then there are cases where I do see where many young people do get it. So, I don't want to come down and rain on the parade or be too negative, but all I'm expressing is it's a tough job to try to get the truth out there.
Well, it is, and it is down to individuals as well, because there are some young people that will be very open to this kind of information if you'll engage them in a conversation with it. And I often find with the sort of work that I do and the genres I deal with, if you start talking to some young people about Kanye West and Jay-Z and Rick Ross and Lil Wayne and Nicki Minaj, and you say to them, there's stuff you need to know about these artists, there's symbolism that are going in their videos, which is connected with the world of the dark occult, you will have them from the get-go. And you'll see that spark of curiosity in their eyes. And they'll say, what is it? What is it about Kanye? Yeah, I've often thought there's something a bit strange about him. And then you can say, well, Kanye would appear to be a victim of mind control, trauma-based mind control. That's why he appears dissociated so often. That's why he rambles incoherently on stage. That's why he was put together with Kim Kardashian. And some young people will be absolutely captivated by that, and they'll want to know more because it's Kanye West, it's Kim Kardashian. These are names that are in popular culture. They're names they're familiar with, and people love celebrities and they want to know everything there is to know about them. But then, as you say, there'll be other people whose eyes will glaze over the minute you start talking about it. They'll write you off as that conspiracy nut, or they just won't be interested. They just won't want to hear it at all. And I think this comes down to something that I mentioned earlier in the conversation, which is our individual soul's journey. I think, we come here to learn certain lessons and to grow and evolve in certain ways. And for some people, the lessons their soul needs to learn and the experiences they need to go through may well involve spending a lifetime in ignorance. So the reason these subjects don't engage them is because that's not the path they're on this time round. They've come to live a life of ignorance, and people might ask, well, where's the value for a spirit or a soul in living a life of ignorance? Well, if you take the view that we go through many different life experiences, which I believe we do, this isn't the only one, then it's a continuous process of successive lifetimes. And you go through different experiences each time round. So for some people, they'll be more advanced in their journey than others, which means they're more amenable to this type of information and to truth. And others may be, further back on the journey or on just a different kind of journey, and they're not ready to hear that information. And you can sense that when you're talking to somebody, whether they're going to be open to it or not. And I'm sure we've often felt that we're just wasting our time and banging our heads against a brick wall when we're trying to get through to certain people, because they just reject every piece of truth that you try to offer. They scoff at it. They laugh at you. They ridicule you. And I think we just have to take the view that these people are not going to get it, not this go round. And you have to leave those people alone. Let them tread their own path. It's their free will. It's their choice. And you concentrate on the people that are showing a glimmer of interest. And just try and engage them, because you can just waste too much time preaching to people that just don't want to hear it, I feel.
Well, that's a good point, because in the beginning, when I was first getting into research, I would take things that I found and I would try to express them to family. And I was shocked at how they were not open. Actually, some of them had become very belligerent toward me for talking about some of the stuff I was trying to talk to them about. Basically, I got tired of being a punching bag. So I had to pull back, and I had to learn for myself that you just can't take this stuff and march it out to anybody, because not everybody's going to accept it. In fact, a small minority of people are going to have ears. So now what happens is I have taken the position, which it sounds like you have the very same position, is I will do the work, I will do the research, I will present it, and that's how I'm going to approach it. If it resonates with you, then you take it. Maybe you could take it further, do some more of your own research, do your own homework. If this is something you're not interested in, I am not going to evangelize you. I am not going to chase you down the football field and tackle you, because it's just not your time to understand this stuff. I mean, that's basically where I have come to be with this also.
And it's difficult when those close to you, family members, just don't seem to get it and don't seem to have an interest in the sort of stuff that you're trying to engage them in, because it's part of your instinct to want to get them on board with you. But even close family members sometimes just aren't showing the signs of getting it or being interested in it, and you have to kind of pull back from them as well, which is a very difficult process. But it just becomes obvious when you need to do that, I feel.
Yeah, you do have to make adjustments. I've had to make adjustments, and I have to keep the peace when I go to family gatherings. I can't show up as, Mike the conspiracy guy, because that's some of them,
So you're not Sage of Quay on those occasions?
No, I'm just Mike. But you have to measure it with friends and family. I mean, I think the objective here is not to go around pissing people off left and right. Like I said, it's a matter of there are people who are game, who are ready to hear this. They're at that point, like you said, in their soul's development, where, okay, it's time. And so they will grab onto it, it resonates with them, and they will do something with it, and they will wake up. And then there's a whole slew of other people out there where this stuff is never going to mean anything to them, at least in this lifetime. And so they're going to live their life in that matrix. And like you said, that's a lesson, right? So, when you go do your life review after you leave this life, it's going to be, so how was it living in the matrix? How was it being lied to and deceived? Did you like it? So, and maybe the next time around, it'll be a different role that they'll play.
Yeah. But, I think it is important also that we take a bit of time out to do normal, in inverted commas, stuff sometimes as well, because another thing about this type of work is it can become obsessive. And I'm quite thankful for the fact that I do have a family around me, actually, because it gives me something to something else to do with my time. You know, I have family responsibilities. And if I didn't have that, I'm the type of guy, it's my nature that I would probably throw myself into this work to such a degree that I'd be up for sort of 3 nights straight without sleeping, and I wouldn't go out of the house. I'd just stay there with the curtains drawn, doing this research and getting depressed and getting bogged down by it all. I think we need a release valve sometimes, and so we do need to do normal stuff. Go out for a walk in the park, go out for a meal, go to the pub and have a drink if you want to do that. You know, go to the store and buy some groceries. You just need to do normal stuff sometimes to keep a balance, because we deal with some dark and heavy information, and it can get on top of you if you don't strike that kind of balance. So this is not something to be doing 24/7, I would suggest. You know, you do as much as you need to do or you feel you're able to do, but be human and have a life as well.
Great advice. I tell people the same thing. You have to live your life. You're here to live your life.
And we're supposed to be enjoying ourselves. You know, I know it's difficult to have fun sometimes when you're aware of the insidious nature of the control system, but, you know, part of the life experience is supposed to be about joy and fun.
I've spoken to others in the truth movement, in the conspiracy research community, Mark, and, we'll talk offline, and they'll say to me, Mike, this is getting very depressing. I don't feel very motivated. It just seems like the whole world is hell in a handbasket. And I said, look, you need to step back from this stuff. Okay, it's all right to research it and, to do your podcasts or do your documentaries, write your book, whatever it may be. But like you said, you have to take a break from this. You are here to also enjoy your life, to spend time with your spouse, your partner, your children, your family, your friends, and to have a good time. And you said the word balance, and that's perfect, because that's exactly what it is. You have to strike a balance.
Yeah, I feel so. Sometimes you can feel guilty for having fun. I don't know if you've ever felt like that, but since discovering the true nature of this world, there are times where I don't enjoy myself and have fun as much as I used to, but on the rare occasions that I do, I sometimes find myself feeling guilty, and I think I shouldn't be this happy when there's so much suffering and madness going on in the world. And then I kind of stop and check myself and think, well, you shouldn't feel guilty for it, because there's a lot of people out there that all they do is party, all they do is have fun. They don't take on any kind of responsibility for trying to make this world a better place. And as long as you're doing something, then don't feel bad about having a bit of fun from time to time, because, as you just said, it's part of the life experience.
You have to recharge. You have to take time to recharge so you can go back and fight the battle. If you're constantly in battle and you never get a break or take a breather, then what's going to happen is you're just going to become useless. You're going to lose your motivation, or worse. People can be in mental states that are not healthy. So it's very, very important to stay healthy, to strike that balance, get recharged, and then you can fight the battle that way. Now, I did want to ask you about, because I think we would be remiss without talking about Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
So
Uncle Jim.
Yeah, Uncle Jim. So this goes along with the perception that was put out there about Jimmy Savile. So for the folks that are listening that might not be familiar with Jimmy Savile, he was a British icon for a very long time. And then upon his death in 2011, it came out that he was a serial pedophile and heavily into the dark occult. And so, in fact, Mark, I wrote this down on Wikipedia. This is the narrative. It never mentions his sordid life. It says, Sir, so he was knighted, Sir James Wilson Vincent Jimmy Savile was an English DJ, television and radio personality, dance hall manager, and charity fundraiser. So what's going on here that a happy face is still being put on a very evil person? Because the thing with Savile is he's no longer on the pages of conspiracy theorists. His whole sordid life of being a serial pedophile went right into the mainstream. It was all into the British tabloids and so on. And yet we still have a narrative like this on Wikipedia. So could you give your view on what the heck is going on here?
Well, that Wikipedia piece, surely further down, it must talk about his sexual misconduct. There must be a reference to it there, right?
There is a reference to it, but my point being is that if you're first going to look for Jimmy Savile, that's what they stick up there. They stick up all of the propaganda, the happy face stuff, and you have to actually go in and read to find out that he was a pedophile.
I think that says a lot about Wikipedia, to be honest, because that site masquerades as a website of the people, which is put together by the people, and we're told that anyone can edit an article and it's just a composite of what many different people have contributed. But I think it's pretty clear that Wikipedia is absolutely controlled by the intelligence services, and it's the official version of everything. So it's what they want you to think. So you can look up something like, for instance, the flat earth theory. Oh my God, did he just say that? Yes, he did.
You could say it on my show, my friend, because I'm there with you.
Yeah. But you can look up flat earth. So if you're somebody that's heard some stuff about this and you don't quite know what to think, the first source that you'll think to go to probably is Wikipedia, because that's the source that most people first think of. So you go to that and they'll tell you that the flat earth theory is this antiquated idea from several hundred years ago, and it's now been completely misproven by science, and anyone that now believes in it is a Luddite and probably a bit mentally unstable, and they're not particularly bright and clever because they don't understand science. So people are going to go away with that impression of what this whole thing is all about because Wikipedia told them so. So you get that with lots of things. If you look up David Icke, for instance, on Wikipedia, it doesn't matter what anyone thinks of David Icke. I know there's a whole load of different opinions about him, but that site will tell you that he comes out with these wild, wacky, crazy theories that can't be proven, and it just portrays him as a bit of an unstable character, really, which is not a very fair and balanced account of what he's all about and what his work represents. So I do think Wikipedia is absolutely controlled. So it doesn't surprise me that they're trying to underplay Savile's role in establishment paedophilia, because that is the case. There's been a desperate attempt by the BBC particularly to portray Savile as a lone operator. Just this guy out on his own agenda. He had no particular affiliations or connections. He was just this guy that got up to all these terrible things over the course of 50 years, and nobody knew about it. Honestly, we had no clue. There he was raping children in his BBC dressing room after he's filmed an episode of Top of the Pops, and he did this from the 1950s for about the next 40 odd years under who knows how many director generals, and nobody had any idea it was going on, and we only discovered it after he died. Just one of those things, folks, only came to light a year after he died. And of course we feel terrible about it now, but there's nothing we could do at the time because we didn't know. And as for the Queen knighting him twice, because once wasn't enough, she had no idea, bless her. Didn't have a clue. I know MI5 are supposed to do background checks into all the people that the Queen comes into contact with, but they just happened to miss the fact that he was a serial paedophile and necrophiliac for several decades. And the same goes for all the other paedophiles that the Queen's knighted. All these other sirs and all these other lords that have since been exposed as child rapists, only after they've died, mind. It only ever seems to come to light after they've died. But, there was Greville Janner, and there was Lord McAlpine, and there was Sir Cyril Smith, and there were all these other, Sir Clement Freud, all these other sirs, that have since been exposed. And the Queen had no idea, bless her. She just didn't know. So that's the impression that the general public's being given. Jimmy Savile presented Top of the Pops, which was this household name TV music show that ran on the BBC from 1964 for 50 years. Or 40 odd years, I think it was. And they're showing repeats of that show. They show them consistently. They go back to, they're on 1983 at the moment, and they show every episode of that program on the week that it was first broadcast, so we're getting all the January 1983 programs at the moment. But every old episode of Top of the Pops that you see, not a single reference to Jimmy Savile. He's been spliced out of every one. You will not see him on any of those shows. So they're trying to pretend that he never even existed, just to downplay the whole thing. But when you look into it, you understand that Savile had connections to the very upper levels of the establishment. He was closely affiliated with the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and he used to spend Christmases at her family home several years in a row, Can't imagine anything worse than spending Christmas with Jimmy Savile, but there you go. And he was also closely affiliated with the royal family. He was a close friend of Prince Charles. Prince Charles visited him at his home in Scotland, his cottage in Glencoe. There's footage and photographs of that. Prince Charles is said to have given Jimmy Savile a pair of gold cufflinks for his 80th birthday with the phrase or the words, "Dear Jimmy, no one will ever know what you've done for this country," engraved in it, which could have a double meaning. And so Jimmy Savile was involved with Stoke Mandeville Hospital Spinal Injuries Unit in Aylesbury, where he had access to the ward where you had disabled kids that were bedridden and couldn't move. And so now we have revelations that he was having his way with, you know, these poor kids, these vulnerable victims. He also volunteered to work in Leeds General Infirmary in the mortuary, and he worked on the night shift, which gave him access to dead bodies in the middle of the night. You know, the mind boggles as to what went on there. And he was also involved with Broadmoor Mental Health Hospital as well. And he was a close associate of Peter Sutcliffe, who's the Yorkshire Ripper. There's footage and photographs online of Jimmy Savile introducing Peter Sutcliffe to the boxer Frank Bruno, which seems to be quite an interesting group of people there. So there's so much more to know about Savile and how he was connected. And he was very much a gatekeeper for these establishment paedophile rings, institutionalized paedophilia, and he was evidently a procurer of children for these people as well. Someone else that he was closely linked with was the former British Prime Minister Edward Heath, who was in office from 1970 to 74. And there are lots of boys, young boys, that went missing from children's homes at that time that were seen in the presence of Jimmy Savile and or Edward Heath. They went out on a yacht that Heath used to sail out to Jersey, and they were never seen again. So he was very far from a lone operator. And what you're seeing is desperate exercises in damage limitation to try and underplay the extent of his connections. And he was far from the only paedophile employed by the BBC as well, as has come out in subsequent years. You had Jonathan King, who was another radio and TV presenter who was a serial paedophile, preyed on young boys at a disco that he used to run called the Walton Hop, which gave him access to these kids. And Gary Glitter, the 70s glam rock singer, was a part of that whole scene as well. And then you had people like Stuart Hall, who was a television presenter. He was an OBE as well, knighted by the Queen. He was exposed as a paedophile in later years. Rolf Harris, of course, the very high-profile children's entertainer, again, unfettered access to kids, was exposed as a sexual deviant and sex pest as well, and has done jail time for that. And there were many, many others. A guy called Chris Denning, who was a Radio 1 DJ, was also a procurer of kids for paedophiles. So the BBC are in it up to their disgusting, sordid necks, and that organisation is absolutely an expression of the depravity and the filth that goes on beneath the surface of the establishment in the UK. And it will be no different in the US, as you well know, Mike, and
right,
in all other countries around the world. And I know you've had the whole Pizzagate thing just recently, which has been giving Americans a glimpse of the cesspit that lurks beneath the surface of politics and the establishment there. And I don't really know what the latest is on that. You probably do, but in the same way that a lot of British people seem content to write the whole Jimmy Savile thing off as, well, he's dead now and we've learnt our lesson. I'm very concerned that the Pizzagate thing is just going to fizzle out and go the same way. And there's going to be exercises in damage limitation there to just give the impression that it was fake news and there's no foundation to it. And so people that were initially shocked will now just go about their business and say, oh, well, you know, business as usual. There was nothing to it. And what was a wonderful chance to finally expose the true extent of the vice and depravity of the elite ruling class will have been squandered. You know, that's a bit of a concern right now.
Well, it is fizzing out. Pizzagate is, I can tell you that, Mark. It was hot and heavy with the WikiLeaks release before the election. And it had a good run, maybe for about 4 to 6 weeks, I would say, and then I started seeing that it was starting to tail off. Now, there are still some researchers out there that are still pushing it, but what is clear and I think it's the same thing with Savile as we're seeing with Pizzagate, is law enforcement. Law enforcement has no desire whatsoever, at least overtly, to tackle it, to investigate. You don't read anything about any investigations taking place with regard to Pizzagate. So it's one of those things, it popped up. A lot of people got, really taken back by it. Those of us that have been in the research community weren't surprised by it. Maybe we were surprised that it finally came out the way it did. But
in terms of the revelations, we were like, and what?
And what?
It's just more of the same. And, we're surprised that people are shocked by this. But for many people, it was the first time they've heard that the elite political class could be embroiled in paedophilia.
Yeah. So for folks like you and I and others, I mean, it was validation of what we've been talking about and looking into for many years. But I'm seeing it right now. It's losing traction. It's losing legs. So unless something happens, that's something happening behind the scenes where maybe the Justice Department or the FBI is investigating, I don't know. I haven't really seen anything that to substantiate that that's actually going on. I think it's going to go the same way as Jimmy Savile. Now, I did see a documentary going back, I want to say about a month ago, where they said that Savile, along with his pedophilia and all his other antics, that he was a high-level priest, black magician, and a disciple of Aleister Crowley. And I also watched an interview, I guess it took place many years ago. I guess it was Johnny Rotten that was on with Piers Morgan.
Yeah.
And Johnny Rotten had openly said that, this guy was a pedophile, and people that were around him and knew him knew it. My understanding is that when Johnny Rotten had that interview after that, he was essentially blackballed for a long time.
Well, that's the story that he tells, yeah. This was 1978, and he's doing this TV interview, and the Sex Pistols were still just about together then, I guess. And he's just saying, there are lots of people I want to kill. And he runs through this list, and then he says, Jimmy Savile. He said, I'd like to kill Jimmy Savile. I bet he's into all kinds of sordid seediness that we're not allowed to talk about on TV. And he says that from that point, he was kind of shut down in terms of media appearances because he'd obviously touched a nerve. And there have been other references on TV as well. There's a British comedian called Frank Skinner, and he used to do this show with David Baddiel and Skinner. And they're doing this routine years ago, probably early 90s, I guess. And they just get on to sordid sexual behavior. And Frank Skinner just makes this noise like Jimmy Savile used to do, this yodel, sort of his trademark sound, And it's like he's giving a knowing nod to those in the know that he's making a reference to Savile. So they knew. And then you have all these other BBC personalities who, in the wake of the Savile revelations, all came out and said, well, everyone kind of knew in the corporation. It was an open secret. We all knew there was something about Savile, but we didn't want to say. We weren't able to say. And nobody really liked him, but we just couldn't say, giving the impression that he was protected at very high levels. So people think that he was, well, definitely a Freemason and some kind of occult priest as well. There are witnesses that have said they've seen him conducting satanic rituals in robes, in basements, So he was into dark occult practices, probably of the Aleister Crowley type.
That's the same thing Crowley used to do with his robes and all his paraphernalia, yep.
Yeah, so he was probably a disciple of Crowley. So there was a lot more to know about the guy, but it just speaks volumes that he was close to the Pope, or to successive popes. He was close to the Queen of England, Prince Charles, successive British prime ministers. He was a high-ranking BBC presenter for many years. All the clues are there, folks. Who's really going to say or going to accept that nobody knew what he was up to? All the clues are there. How many do you need? And this is another thing. Often when you present items of information to people and you confront them with truths, they will scoff at it. They will tell you you're mad. They will tell you it can't possibly be true. And you can say to them, well, I know you don't believe that it's true, but just supposing for a minute, suspend your incredulity and just imagine for a moment that what I'm saying was going on. Would you want to know about it? And I think most people in a situation like that would say, well, yeah, I would want to know about it. So then when you tell them that actually it is going on, they still don't accept it. And they say, no, that doesn't sound right at all. Oh, really? Well, I guess you didn't really want to know after all. Because I'm thinking of people in the States, right? And if you'd said to them, before this whole spirit cooking and Pizzagate thing blew up and all these Podesta emails, if you'd said to the average American, if your leaders, your politicians, people that you look up to and who are supposed to have your interests at heart, were involved in sordid activity like child trafficking and child torture and paedophilia, would you want to know about it? I think the average American would have said, of course I would. Yeah, absolutely. I'd need to know about that. So then we have these revelations which come out and all the evidence to support them. And as you've said, the whole thing seems to be fizzling out. So people aren't getting mad about it. They don't seem to be getting up in arms about it and demanding that something is done about it. They just seem to be kind of writing it off and accepting the idea that it was fake news, or just accepting the idea there's nothing they could do about it. So how much would they really have want to know if when they do know, not a whole lot happens? It's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, they go back to their ball games and their beer.
And meanwhile, more children are getting tortured and who knows what.
Right. Now, this is going to segue into my next question, because Savile was within many bands' circle of influence. And one of those bands, and you and I have obviously talked about the Beatles with a show that I was on your show a few weeks back, and we talked about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And we talked about it from the perspective of the book, Tom Harriet's book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. Your opinion, Mark, because I get this question asked. People will say, well, what does this really mean? It's like the same thing with the flat earth. What difference does it make if the earth is flat or what shape it is? I will get the response back from some folks and say, well, why is it important that the Paul is Dead conspiracy should be even talked about? What is the most important aspect in your mind of the McCartney death conspiracy that people need to consider and understand?
Well, it does astound me when you get into subjects like this and people give the kind of reaction you just outlined. They say, what does it really matter? Why should I care? Are you kidding? With the flat earth thing, without getting into the detail of it, because that's for other podcasts, but people say, what does it matter what shape the earth is? Well, if it's not the shape that we've been told it is, and if it's in fact motionless and not spinning through space at 1,000 miles an hour and 66,000 miles an hour around the solar system and all the rest of it, and the sun is not really 93 million miles away as we've been told, don't you think it's kind of important that we should know? And don't you think that raises questions about why the scientific establishment and mainstream education has been telling us that for the past 500 years? Don't you think there might be some ulterior motive in them giving us that disinformation? Doesn't it concern you that generation after generation has been given erroneous information of this nature? That's not important to you? Don't you want to know why you were lied to and what the implications are of this? How can anyone not want to know that or not think it's important? And so you can apply that to the Paul McCartney thing. So you'll say to some people, Paul McCartney, or the person we think of in the world today as James Paul McCartney, is not the original James Paul McCartney. It's somebody else. And a lot of people will say, well, he may be, he may not be. What does it really matter? The music's still good. Well, it matters because one of the most famous people in the world has been replaced by somebody else in a deception of a monumental scale. And millions of people around the world have fallen for it and have been taken in and have been duped. And you don't think that's important. You don't think that raises questions as to who was behind this, what the motive was, why they would want to lie to us and deceive us in this way. What does it say about the nature of those that would cover something like this up, and what kind of organizations they might belong to, what kind of oaths of secrecy they might have taken, and what that says about the rest of us and the way that they view us? Of course it's important. So we really do need to get to the bottom of this. And with so many subjects, Mike, what I'm coming to understand is, we spoke earlier about how you can dive down these rabbit holes, and the more you get into stuff, the more you understand how little you know and how much more there is to know. I've come to realize that with so many subjects, it's easier to say what is not happening with them than to come to a definitive answer as to what is happening. So you state it in the apophatic sense. So when it comes to flat Earth, I'm harping on about it a bit, and I know that it's going to generate a response, but whatever. I feel the easiest thing is not to try and say what shape it is or what nature it is, whether it's hollow or not, but to state something that we can know for absolute certain, as far as I'm concerned, which is whatever else it may be, it's not moving. It's motionless. You don't think we'd feel it if it was moving? So as far as I'm concerned, that's something that you can state in the apophatic sense. It's not moving. Now you can apply that to the Paul McCartney situation. There's all kinds of theories about who the replacement might be, about whether there's more than one replacement, about whether the original Paul is still alive and sometimes pops back into the role. And you can drive yourself mad trying to make sense of all of this. But there's one thing you can say for certainty in that subject as well, in the apophatic sense, which is it's not Paul McCartney. The person that we see today, that passes himself off as Paul McCartney is not the original Paul McCartney. And as far as I'm concerned, you start from there and build it up. That's your starting point.
Well, it's not Paul McCartney. And the interesting thing is when I show people, of the montage pictures that I did, Mark, I put them on Facebook, and I still have people to this day. I mean, I have 3 charts now, 3 slides that show different pictures of Paul McCartney over the span of 50 years. And I'll start with a picture of what we refer to as the biological Paul, the real James Paul McCartney. And then after that, I'm going to show you a litany of other faces, the different faces of Paul McCartney over time. And it's very, very clear once you do that analysis that it's not the same person. In some pictures, it's not even close. And you still have people that look at it and they will say, looks like the same person to me. So I don't know whether they're pulling my leg or they just do not have the intellectual aptitude to be able to critically think and discern. And it goes back to, like sometimes people will say to us on this topic or any other topic, and they'll say, well, show me proof. And the thing is, most of the proof that they're looking for, they hold the cards. In other words, if they just utilize their God-given gift of critical thinking and observation, they would see and they would become aware what is truth and what is not truth. The problem that we have is that people resort to authority. That's what they do. Yep. They just conclude that they're just not that smart, that there are people out there and organizations that are there that are much smarter than they are and will tell them how things are or how things should be or how you should think or what your belief system should be and what your value system should be. And people just fold their cards and they conform to that. That's what boggles my mind. And the reason why I brought up the Paul McCartney topic was because, to me, like you said, it's very, very important. Because if they're able to replace somebody, especially in 1966 when the Beatles were at the peak of their success, and be able to get away with it. I mean, of course, there were people that called it out, but they were a small minority. And continue on with the charade. That says something about, well, what else are they deceiving you about?
Well, yeah. And what proof would people need? You say people say, show me the proof. It seems to me that a lot of people would accept nothing less than the person we think of as Paul McCartney getting on national television one day and saying, folks, I've got something to tell you. I'm not the real Paul McCartney. I'm an imposter. I've been playing the role. I was employed by British military intelligence to do this. This is my real name. This is who I really am. This is what really happened to Paul. I think he could do that, and there would still be people that would say, nah, he's pulling your leg. He's having a laugh. That's Paul. It's just a big joke.
Yeah.
And I think people make themselves see and believe what they want to see and believe. So you say that you can show those different comparison pictures of all the different McCartneys to certain people, and they'll say, well, all I see is Paul. It's the same guy. You just got to wonder if there's something about their consciousness that is physically affecting their vision and making them see that it's the same person, because they so need to believe that it is, because the idea that it could be different people is just so terrible to them that they couldn't possibly comprehend it. I mean, the composite of pictures that you put out was a real eye-opener to me, because I'd tended towards the idea that Paul McCartney was replaced by an individual who's been playing the part for the past 50 years. End of story. And that composite of images made me consider that maybe there's been more than one replacement.
Yep.
And I know that our mutual friend Ellen Rain, that we connect with virtually daily on Facebook, and also Tina Foster, are of the view that there was more than one Paul replacement. And I'm certainly coming round to that idea now. So, this begs the question of who really is Billy Shears, the William Shepherd of the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, because you and I spoke about that book at length. And, the implication that comes from that is that you have this guy, William Shepherd, who took the place of Paul McCartney. But maybe it's not always been Shepherd. Is it William Shepherd we see today? Or was William Shepherd one of the earlier replacements? Now suddenly you've got a whole bunch of new questions, to tie you up in knots and befuddle you. And again, the only truth in all of it that you can say with any certainty, as far as I'm concerned, is that this person that claims to be Paul McCartney is not Paul McCartney. That's the only thing that I'm absolutely certain of. We don't know if the original Paul died. Certainly the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and all the symbology and all the Beatles legends suggest that he did die in a car crash in 1966, but we've got no proof of that. Did he just fade into the shadows somewhere and live out his life out of the public spotlight? We just don't know. But another question people need to ask themselves is, how could this replacement have taken place? Because this couldn't take place through just a pop group and its manager deciding to pull a stunt like this. It would have to have occurred with the complicity of British military intelligence and very high levels of the police, the judiciary, the government, in order to tie up all the loose ends and cover up the aspects of it that needed to be covered up. You don't just replace somebody and get away with it and have an imposter taking their place for the next 50 years with no repercussions, unless you're connected into these very high levels of the establishment. So that then raises questions about the true nature of the Beatles. Were they just four lads from Liverpool that picked up some musical instruments and formed a group and composed some nice songs and worked really hard, did a few gigs, had some success and became a household name? Or was their entire career facilitated by certain parties? And were they put on the map by those that can make these things happen for much more far-reaching purposes? Was it pure random chance that they became the most successful and popular music group of not just the 1960s, but probably popular music history? I think few people would argue with the notion that the Beatles are the most successful and well-known pop group of all time. Does that sort of thing happen by accident or just at random, or is it made to happen by those that control culture and social engineering? And when you get into the deep levels of the sort of research that I go into in my book, and many others do as well, you come to understand that nothing like that does happen by chance.
No, it doesn't happen by chance. And, Mark, it's 50 years later, and actually it's more than 50 years, because the Beatles really came onto the scene with their first album, Please Please Me, back in March of 1963. So we're talking about almost 55 years now.
Sure.
And they are still a monstrosity of a force in the entertainment business, in the music business, merchandise, and so on. So to have that kind of shelf life means that, people will point to the music and say, well, Mike, it's because the music was great. Yes, the music, I'm a big Beatle freak, so I love the Beatles music, but I'm also a realist, and I think to myself, well, how does something have that type of longevity, that type of shelf life? It's 55 years later.
Yeah.
And it's still there. It's still being presented to us.
And now we've got the story of Fall taking on Sony now. Sony Music, the empire over Beatles publishing and the rights to certain Beatles songs. And the audacity of the guy. He's protesting songs that were written before he came on the scene. So it would have been the original Paul that wrote those early Beatles songs, and he's going up against Sony over the rights to these songs, the publishing and the copyright and stuff. And you think to yourself, well, Michael Jackson had a very public dispute with Sony, and we know how that ended up. And George Michael had a very public dispute with Sony, and we know how that ended up. So Fall doesn't seem fazed by that at all. he seems to be going up against them with a great deal of confidence and a great deal of, or a great lack of fear that anything might happen to him. So that to me suggests a very connected individual.
Oh, he's very connected. And what I found interesting about that story, Mark, is that when he took over the role of the biological Paul, I mean, in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears by Tom Hugh Harriet, what he says is, hey, look, it's just show business. It's just business. There's nothing to be alarmed about. You know, don't be upset. This goes on all the time. People play different roles, take on different roles, and so on and so forth. It's just business. So here we have a situation with Sony could turn around to him and say, Bill, it's just business.
Yeah. Come on, man. You said
business.
Yourself in your book.
Yeah. So it's kind of, when I read that, I kind of chuckled to myself because I thought to myself, boy, that really boomeranged back to you, Bill. And I'm talking about Bill Shepherd, folks, William Shepherd. It's the man that's playing Paul McCartney as we speak.
Yeah.
So, just very interesting stuff.
Let me ask you, Mike, let me just fire a question your way. You know, how do you feel about the idea that there was more than one replacement of Paul? Is it your feeling that the guy we've got today is Billy Shears, William Shepherd, and that he's had the full-time role going all the way back to 66, but there have been others that have kind of stepped in to do the odd gig or the odd photo shoot or something like that? Is that how you now feel about it?
Yeah, I never discounted the fact that there may have been others that were playing the role of Paul McCartney. But the way I parse it, Mark, is that I believe that Bill Shepherd was the replacement in 1966, and he is the man that has been writing the music ever since. Beatles, post-Beatles, Wings, and so on.
Right.
Do I believe that other characters filled photo ops, may have appeared on film or documentaries or whatever? I can't rule that out because, like you said, when I look at the montage I put together, there are guys that are supposed to be Paul McCartney. They don't look like Bill Shepherd either. Yeah. You know, so I have to come to the conclusion that there are other players involved. Now, there has been a debate on Facebook with our group, and I have stated that the Paul McCartney that is in Let It Be is Bill Shepherd. And because that's the same guy that did the interview in 1967, he had a hairpiece on, a wig. It was very obvious. And I'll put the link to that particular interview in the show notes. And that was Bill Shepherd. Post 1966, this was during the Sgt. Pepper era, 1967. It was really the first interview that he did. It was very clear to me now that I go back and look at that interview that it's not the original Paul. This guy had an air of, he was all about himself. He was very confident, and he just was, you could tell he was just very inward about himself. And when I heard him speak in that 1967 interview, and then when I went back and listened to the dialogue, I actually watched the movie again, Let It Be. I did that about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's the same person speaking. It's the same person speaking. It's the same voice. It's the same cadence when he speaks. So it's the same guy in 67 and the same guy in Let It Be, my opinion. Now, I know there's going to be some that are going to be screaming at me and telling me it's not. There's a different guy, in the Let It Be movie. I don't think so. Yeah. But I do believe that it's very possible that others filled in here and there. I do not subscribe to others recorded as Paul McCartney. I think that was always Shepherd. I mean, even if we go back to the 1980s in the movie Give My Regards to Broad Street, that was Bill Shepherd, because there's a scene in that movie where he walks into the recording studio, and I guess there's an engineer sitting there, and he says, hello, William.
Do you know William? Yeah.
Would you know William? Yes. So that's Bill Shepherd. So I think that he's been the main player. As he says in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, he's got the main contract. He's got the permanent contract, as he puts it. And even in the book, he states that there were others, but they did not have permanent contracts like him. So in the book, he states that. So I'm going to ride with that. Now, trying to decipher who is who, we will never know that, Mark. And I've stopped doing that. I never really ventured into it because it was hard enough to find out who William Shepherd was.
We need Heather's box of evidence. We need to do a Watergate-style burglary of wherever Heather's holding her box of evidence and see what's in that damn thing.
Yeah, I mean, like, who was this guy, with Wings in 1973 or whatever? And, is that William Shepard or somebody else? We're never going to know that. So,
Yeah.
and to me, at the end of the day, what I'm really concerned about is not whether we had 2 or 3 or 4 Pauls. I mean, that's interesting, but it's really the program that Tavistock had in place, which was to deceive and to see the reaction, to see if people would catch on to the fact that somebody was clearly replaced.
Yeah.
And not just replaced and stuck in a closet, replaced and put in the spotlight, having a very, very successful career as a musician, as an entertainer for 50 years.
Well, we spoke about this before, and I just wonder what the plan would have been if in 1966 or 67 the general public had rumbled the replacement and had basically said, that's not Paul McCartney. What's going on? What are you trying to do to us? They must have been so confident that they could pull it off and that kind of reaction wouldn't come, to have had the audacity to undertake something like this. It's probably worth just raising again something that I've spoken about in previous interviews, but this appeared on Tina Foster's Plastic Macca blog, where she posted a piece of footage from a TV show by Derren Brown, the British illusionist, that he put out a few years ago. So he's trying to show how little people pay attention to detail of things, and that can include what somebody looks like. So he's there in London, and he's got this map out, and he's stopping passers-by, and he's saying, excuse me, can you show me how to get to, and I'd missed this before, this had to be pointed out to me. He's asking for directions to St. Paul's Cathedral, right? And so he stops all these people, and he says, I'm trying to get here, and they say, oh yeah, you need to go this way, and they're looking at the map, and while they're doing that, he's got a couple of accomplices that walk past with a great big painting. And they say, excuse me, coming through. And while the person's looking at the map, Derren Brown jumps behind the painting, and one of the guys that was carrying it takes his place with a map in his hand. And then the person that's given the directions looks up. It's no longer Derren Brown. It's a different guy. And they go, okay, then there you go. And they haven't noticed that he's been switched. And he does this on 3 separate occasions with people that look nothing like him. And the person with the map doesn't notice that they've been switched. And another aspect of this that I'd missed until it was pointed out to me is that at the very end of the sequence, he says, I'm sure that wouldn't have gone so well if I tried it with, let's say, one of the world's leading pop stars, or words to that effect. And it seems to me like that is a knowing nod on his part to the fact that McCartney was replaced and nobody seemed to have noticed. They just got rid of it. I've got to say, another thing that you hear so often is the claim that many other musicians have been replaced in the same way. You get it with the Beatles. A lot of people say John Lennon was replaced, or maybe George was replaced, and you hear it with other musicians as well. And I don't really go for the notion that there's been a whole bunch of replacements. I tend to go with the idea that it was just McCartney. Reason being, we had so much symbolism around the McCartney replacement. There were so many clues placed into the Beatles record sleeves, placed into their audio recordings in the form of backmasking and even forwards messages, little hints and clues dropped in interviews where George would refer to Paul and, Paul would walk into a room and people would say, hello, William. So many of these clues that hint at a replacement, which you don't get with the other artists. I've not seen hundreds and hundreds of little symbolic clues to suggest that John Lennon was replaced. And the controllers that we have, being dark occultists, do feel the need to place the truth in plain sight and give an opportunity for us to know what they're up to. Revelation of the method is a very important tenet of theirs. So we see that all the time with Paul, but not with other musicians. And that's what tends to make me think it was just something that happened with McCartney. And they've been trying to tell us.
I agree. With regard to what if the public had figured out that he was replaced, I was asked this question on Derek Hess's show going back a few weeks ago. And I had said if they had figured it out, let's say the rumors had gotten enough legs, enough traction, and enough people paid attention, they said, wait a minute, that's not the same guy. What are you guys doing? I think that they would have come clean. They just would have said, look, all right, look. The real Paul, he died in 1966. It was a horrible accident. The Beatles mean so much to everybody. And by the way, this guy, Bill Shepard, he promises to fill his shoes. And you like Sgt. Pepper, right? Isn't Sgt. Pepper a great album? And what about Magical Mystery Tour? And, however many albums were in between people figuring it out and when he arrived, they would just point to the music and they would say, look, it's good stuff, right? And I think the population would have just said, okay, and they would have went about their business. I think that that's probably what would have happened. So I don't think that Tavistock or British intelligence were quaking in their boots. I think maybe originally they were like, okay, I hope this works. But I think as time went on, they had a game plan, a strategy in place. And because the question had to be tabled, in discussions when they were planning this all out, what happens if everybody figures it out? And they had to have an answer to that. And I think the answer would have been, we'll just come clean and people will just roll over and we'll continue to ride the wave.
Yeah. You could be right. I don't know if you feel the same, but I think those of us in the Paul is Dead research community that are really trying to get this story out there are starting to make an impact, because I've noticed McCartney, in inverted commas, has been in the news a lot lately. He's in the spotlight. We've got this story about him going up against Sony. I've seen pictures in the tabloid papers and celebrity mags recently of him on holiday with his daughter Stella and with his wife Nancy walking down the street. He appeared in the 8 Days a Week Beatles movie directed by Ron Howard that came out last year, just making out he's the same old Paul, and he's remembering the good old days, and this is what it used to be like, because he's Paul and he would know. But we're just seeing a lot of Paul. He's doing interviews. He's still out there. He's nearly 80 years of age, if the memoirs of Billy Shears is to be believed. He was born in 37, so he turns 80 this year. And yet he's still out there. He's doing shows. He's doing interviews. And it almost seems as if the powers that be, the establishment, the controllers, are kind of shoving him down our throats and saying, here's Paul. It's the same old Paul, always has been, business as usual. Never mind all this nonsense about him being replaced. Of course it's Paul. You can see it's Paul, and I think that's why we're seeing so much of him. Another interesting thing, though, that I wanted to bring up is, I think I referred to this in our last interview, and I certainly mention it in the book. There's this piece of footage from John Lennon's Imagine documentary, which came out to accompany his album in 1971. And it was one of the big kind of Paul is Dead clues for quite some time. I think it appears in the Winged Beetle movie as well, this excerpt. So you've got John Lennon and George Harrison, and there's somebody else there in the kitchen of Lennon's house where he's recording Imagine, and Yoko Ono's preparing some food for him. And John Lennon says to the camera, here you have a Beatle wife making tea for two of the Fab Four. And then George, in the footage I've seen, says the Fab Three. And then John says, oh yeah, the Fab Three. And then they start talking about this character, Beetle Bill. So he says, I see Beetle Bill's making a pig of himself. And then George says, yeah, he's not doing too well these days. Oh, I hear he's number 3 in Sweden now. And so in this piece of footage, you assume they're talking about this guy called Beetle Bill. But our mutual friend Ellen Rain posted something on Facebook the other week, which is a different version of that piece of footage. And now they're talking about a character called Beetle Ed. And so they say, I hear Beetle Ed is number 3 in Sweden, not doing too well for himself. And then after that, they go on to say, I see Beetle Bill is making a pig of himself. So in the original footage, the references to Beetle Ed have been spliced out. And you assume it's all referring to this character known as Beetle Bill. But now it appears that in its true context, it's referring to Beetle Ed and Beetle Bill. So 2 questions. Who the hell is Beetle Ed? And why did someone feel the need to chop that footage up and splice it back in a different order to make you think it's all about Beetle Bill? That's something that's come to light in the past couple of weeks, and it's raised some questions in my mind.
Yeah, it's raised questions. In fact, I think I sent that original version to Ellen. Based upon that discussion between George and John, there's at least 2 of them. Now, the other thing I had said on the Facebook feed, the comment thread there, was that we also need to be careful because we can't jump to conclusions. We are not really getting those names in context. So because he mentions Beetle Ed, does that mean Beetle Ed was a musician, a songwriter, or is Beetle Ed somebody that's associated with them in some way, maybe in a managerial perspective, or an engineer, a producer, or a friend, whatever.
Right.
So I put that caution out there because we really don't know. We don't know. But it is very weird that the original clip had 2 names, and then the clip that is predominant today is the clip that only mentions Beetle Bill. So that is very odd. Yeah. And that goes basically hand in hand with the pictures that have been doctored and pulled back and stuff like that. I mean, I was reading research where there was an effort to really rein in all of the pictures to make sure that those pictures really only reflected the current guy, Bill Shepard. And there was a photographer. Now, you may know this better than I do, but I think he was Italian, and he had taken pictures of the Beatles back in the days when Biological Paul was there, and he was confronted, and he was asked for his pictures, and he refused to turn his pictures over. Yeah, I don't know if you know about that story.
No,
but
I've not heard
read
that
about
story.
that. Yeah, there's a photographer that was doing photo shoots going back to when Biological Paul was there. I guess he had a whole portfolio, and some guys showed up, and they said, hey, look, we need your pictures.
Well, I think there's a cover-up going on, and I really do feel like they're trying to do some damage limitation, and they realise that there's quite a number of people now that are onto the deception. And that's thanks to people like us that have been putting this thing out there, and we've been told we're crazy and we're imagining things. But if that's the case, and if it really is the same old Paul and it's business as usual, why have we got them shook so much? You know, why are all these measures being taken? Why is fall in the news the whole time? And why are old pictures being doctored and old bits of video and stuff? You know, I've not seen 8 Days a Week, but there are people I know that have seen it that have said they're convinced something's been done to the old footage of Paul, real Paul in certain scenes, to make him look more like Paul. You know, why would they need to do that? Why would they need to doctor it at all?
They did that in Help also, where they did some video editing to basically morph the face. I saw some before and after shots. There are some subtle differences to McCartney's face. So there's a program underway to revise history, to alter the perceptions of people. And I do agree that more and more people are becoming aware of this, Mark. I think that we are shaking some trees. Some of the feedback, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, by the way, from my Paul is Dead shows, and they really enjoyed the conversation you and I had, the first one.
Yeah.
Now, the feedback I'm getting from folks is that they really appreciated the shows because we were talking content. We were talking not just showing clips and, you know, look at this picture, look at that picture, but we actually were talking through a storyline, probable cause, if you will. And that really sparked a lot of interest because before we started presenting it that way, I'm not sure there were many people that were putting it out that way. And so people now are starting to listen to the shows, and they're starting to get the storyline. They're starting to get motive. And, you know, I think now they can grasp onto this a little easier. That's some of the feedback I've been getting. How about yourself?
Yeah. Well, pretty much the same. I've had a few haters and a few deniers, but generally people have said, you know, I had no idea of this, and thank you for bringing this to my attention. And it is all about context, as you say. And I think this is maybe why this whole thing didn't take root back in the 1960s, when there were a few individuals that seemed to spot there was something wrong with Paul. And then in 1969, you had all these kids phoning college radio stations, and all these DJs were playing the clues, and it was going around all these college campuses that McCartney had been replaced. But it kind of fizzled out. It didn't really break into the mainstream, or not as widely as it should have done. But I think now we're living in times where people have some understanding that the world is nothing like we thought it was. And you don't have to be an all-out conspiracy theorist to come to that conclusion. You don't even have to have undergone any kind of conscious awakening. It's just pretty obvious for all to see that politicians lie to us the whole time, and there are networks of different groups that are kind of running things, and pop videos are full of symbolism and dark occult stuff. And we get stories like Pizzagate and Jimmy Savile, and we realize there's pedophilia and there's satanic activity going on. You know, anyone now has the chance to understand all this stuff. So you place the McCartney replacement within that kind of setting, and suddenly it becomes far more plausible than it did when all you had was a bunch of clues on sleeves of Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road and all these audio recordings and stuff. People could quite easily dismiss those and say, oh, this is just fantasy. You see what you want to see. There's no foundation to it. But you place it within the wider context of what's going on in the world and who's running things or seems to be running things. And suddenly it doesn't seem quite so outrageous. It just becomes one of many anomalies and many things that don't quite add up about this world. And maybe that's why people are more amenable to this idea now than they have been in previous times. And that's why it's really getting some legs now.
Yeah. And I also want to mention to folks, and I know you have mentioned the same thing, but if you really want to know more about this, about the whole Paul is Dead conspiracy, then you should consider picking up the Memoirs of Billy Shears by Tom Harriet. Mark nor I have any affiliation with Tom or with Bill Shepard or Paul McCartney, or we're not making any money on this. It's just that it's an excellent book to be able to get that context that Mark was just talking about. It's going to help people to better get an understanding of why and how this could have happened. So, and by the way, Tom Harriet is a real person.
Yeah.
I want to say that too. Now, Mark, we're pushing 2 hours, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. It's just been a great conversation. Now, you're working on a new book, and I was wondering if you can give us some insight into the topics that you're going to cover in the next release.
Absolutely. So I'm working on Musical Truth Volume 2. And as I said earlier, pretty much all of this year is going to be spent doing that writing, because it takes a long time to assimilate all this information and put it into a form that makes it easily digestible and makes the story flow. Which is quite a difficult process, really, because anyone can collate all this stuff. Not that that's easy in itself, but unless you put it in a form that makes it easy to understand and puts it in its true context, once again, then the story can get misunderstood and misconstrued. So that's why it takes all year to write a book. And so the topic that I'm on at the moment, which I've been writing about all this month, is the acid house scene in the UK, because I've realised that it's 30 years this year since the acid house movement first took off in London in late 1987. And I can remember it. I went to some of these raves and I was very much a part of that whole scene. And I can't believe it's been 30 years, but there you go. And I'm looking at the ways in which that small movement, which originated in London and was absolutely drenched in MDMA, ecstasy, which was the drug of choice that went with that particular music scene, eventually gave way to the massive worldwide phenomenon of electronic dance music that we now have, which literally is enjoyed by young people in nightclubs all over the world, every single continent. It's an absolutely colossal scene. It's still very much fueled by ecstasy and other drugs. And I'm looking at the parallels between that scene and how it came to take a hold and the influence that it had on that young generation of the time in the 1980s going forward, and the counterculture hippie scene of the 1960s, where LSD was everywhere and psychedelic rock music came along to replace what had been there previously. Because to me, it seems as if all the fingerprints of the social engineers and of the manipulations of the hidden hand are there in this acid house electronic dance music scene, as were there in that scene coming out of California 21 years earlier. So I'm getting to the bottom of some of the personnel behind the venues and the festivals and the raves that took place at that time, trying to get to the bottom of where all the ecstasy came from, and just looking at how that scene paved the way for something that completely transformed youth culture. And now we have an electronic dance music scene that's pushing all the same symbolism that the hip hop and pop music scenes did before it. So you're getting pyramids everywhere, you're getting all-seeing eyes, you're getting transhumanist propaganda and symbology everywhere. And this whole scene was prepared by that one small movement. So that's the major part of the book. I'm also looking into the heavy rock and heavy metal genres, because that's not a scene that I've really understood before. I've never really listened to that music, but I'm told by so many people that there's satanic elements there, and there's stuff going into the recordings in terms of backmasking and sound frequencies and things like that. So I really want to understand that genre more. I'm looking at the whole science of sound, actually, sound frequencies and methods of recording and audio production, and the sort of things that can be subliminally layered into music recordings at the production stage. That's another major part of it. And what else? I'm just picking up on some things that I touched on in Volume 1 as well, and giving a bit of an update. So I am going to be touching on the Paul McCartney thing, because as we've discussed in this show today, there are things that have come across my radar in recent times which I wasn't aware of when I wrote the first book. So there will be updates to some of the topics that I covered in Volume 1. But yeah, those are the main points. And the aim is to have Musical Truth 2 on the streets in early 2018. And then I'll be spending next year back on the talk circuit, back on the conference circuit, back doing a whole bunch of radio shows and podcasts to promote it. But for the rest of this year, knuckling down and getting that hard work done.
Yeah, you're an excellent researcher, Mark. In fact, I know folks that have read your book, and they said it's an incredible read. And I'm talking about the first book, Musical Truth. So I just want to plug that for you. And some of the folks that told me this, yeah, these are folks that are in the research community, and they have read the book. And they said to me, Mike, you really need to get Mark's book because it's excellent. Now, Mark, where can folks buy your book, listen to your podcast, and learn more about your research?
Okay, so Musical Truth Volume 1 is available on Amazon. You can get a hardback copy or a paperback version, or there's a Kindle version. And if folk want to get a signed copy from me personally, I am mailing out copies because I know not everyone likes Amazon. They're not the most ethical company in the world. So if people want to bypass Amazon and come directly to me, they can drop me an email. And the email address is markdevlinuk@gmail.com. So that's Mark Devlin UK, all one word, @gmail.com. And just mention that you want a signed copy of the book. And then we can talk about getting that out to you and covering the postage and stuff. If people can pay by PayPal, that's the way that works. So in terms of my podcasts, I've got my Good Vibrations conversation-based series. And I also have a conscious music podcast called The Sound of Freedom, where I play music that's the absolute antithesis of the corporate mainstream agenda. So it's message music. It's music that really resonates from real artists that aren't shackled by corporation owners. So you can get the whole archive of that. And they're all available via my main website, which is markdevlin.co.uk. There's links through to my SoundCloud from there, which is where you find all my audio stuff. And then my YouTube channel is youtube.com/markdevlintv. And there's a bunch of videos up there from some conference appearances that I've done recently, the Free Your Mind conference, the Open Mind conference, where I get into, 2-hour talks about all this stuff, and I show slides with some of the symbolism and things like that on, so people might find it interesting to take a look at those. So the one-stop shop for all of it is basically markdevlin.co.uk.
Excellent. Well, Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. And I promise not to bother you this year, and maybe you can come back in 2018.
Well, I'd love to.
With the release of your second book.
Yeah. And hopefully I might see you at some event or other at some point. Who knows?
Oh, I'd love to make it. I know you're going to be in Philly in April, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to get you there.
That would be great. I would love to. Your
get
presentations.
A bus.
Yeah. No, your presentations are excellent. I watched them on YouTube. I put a number of them up on my blog. You're very, very articulate when you speak. You're very articulate when you present. You really stitch things together very, very well. So I highly recommend that. It's the truth. And anybody who's listening, if this is your first time listening to Mark, I suggest that you go seek him out. Well, Mark, thank you so much. I know I've taken up 2 hours of your time here, but it's been greatly appreciated.
Well, it flew by and we covered some great points, and I always enjoy conversing with you, Mike. So thanks for having me on, and we'll do it again sometime for sure.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, brother.
And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com, or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.